The paradox of choice. Imagine standing in front of a shelf lined with 30 different types of cereal. Chocolate clusters, honey oat, cinnamon crunch, gluten-free, organic, low sugar, high protein, marshmallow filled, and endless combinations in between. You think this is freedom. With so many choices, you're certain you'll find the perfect one. But as you stare, something strange happens. You freeze. The abundance doesn't liberate you, it traps you. This is the paradox of choice. The paradox is simple. We assume that more options lead to more happiness. After all, the more paths available, the greater the chance of finding the right one. But in practice, the opposite often happens. Too many options overwhelm us. Instead of empowering, choice can paralyze. Instead of satisfaction, it breeds regret. Psychologists have tested this. In one study, researchers set up a display of jam samples in a grocery store. When customers were offered 24 different flavors, only 3% actually bought a jar. But when only 6 flavors were offered, 30% bought. Fewer options led to more action. Too many choices and people walk away. Why? Because every choice carries a hidden cost, opportunity. If you choose one cereal, you give up all the others. The more options available, the heavier that loss feels. Your mind starts imagining the road not taken. You eat your cinnamon crunch, but in the back of your head you wonder if the honey oat would have been better. And if you don't choose at all, you avoid regret, but also avoid satisfaction. The paradox cuts deeper than consumer products. It shows up in love, careers, identity, even morality. Dating apps present an endless carousel of potential partners. On paper, this is ideal. More options should increase your odds of finding the right person. But the more profiles you swipe through, the more paralyzed you become. Every match feels temporary, replaceable. Commitment feels like a trap because there might always be someone better, just one swipe away. The same is true in careers with so many paths: medicine, business, art, law, tech, entrepreneurship. It feels impossible to choose. Each decision forecloses dozens of other possible futures, and no matter what you pick, the shadow of what if lingers. Was there a better life waiting on the road you didn't take? Here lies the cruel irony. Choice is supposed to expand freedom, but too much choice chains us with doubt. Instead of living in the present, we live in hypothetical worlds, imagining alternatives that never existed. More choice makes us less free, not more. This raises a disturbing question. Is true freedom found in having every option or in having fewer? Think of the monk who gives up worldly possessions. On the surface, he has no freedom at all. He eats what he's given, wears what he's given, follows a strict daily ritual. But ask him, and he might say he feels freer than anyone else. By eliminating choices, he eliminates conflict, anxiety, regret. In narrowing the field, he finds peace. And yet choice is still essential to human dignity. A life without any options at all, slavery, imprisonment, coercion, is unbearable. So how do we reconcile this? The paradox demands balance. Too few choices and life suffocates. Too many and it overwhelms. Somewhere in between lies the sweet spot where choice empowers without paralyzing. The paradox also exposes a hidden truth about happiness. It doesn't come from maximizing options, it comes from commitment. When you choose one path fully, whether a partner, a career, or even a cereal, you stop looking over your shoulder. You invest in the choice, and in doing so, you transform it into the right one. But most of us struggle with this. We cling to the fantasy that the perfect option exists out there, waiting if only we had more information, more time, more alternatives. The paradox of choice is that perfection multiplies dissatisfaction. The more we chase it, the more we guarantee we'll never feel it. So the real challenge is not deciding what to choose, it's deciding how to live with choosing, to embrace limits, to accept imperfection, and to recognize that meaning comes not from infinite options, but from the finite commitments we make. Freedom is not standing in front of 30 cereals, paralyzed. Freedom is grabbing one, pouring it into a bowl, and eating it without looking back. The omnipotence paradox of language. Imagine trying to describe the color red to someone who has been blind from birth. You can compare it to heat, passion, or anger, but no matter how carefully you choose your words, you can't transmit the direct experience. Language, for all its power, collapses at the edges of perception. This is where the omnipotence paradox of language begins. If words are meant to describe everything, what happens when they encounter something beyond description? The paradox rests on this contradiction. Language is our most powerful tool for expression, yet it is inherently limited. It creates the illusion of infinite possibility, but it falters when confronted with the infinite itself. Can something be both omnipotent and powerless? Can a system built to explain reality also expose the very parts of reality that escape explanation? Consider the word infinite. When you say it, you compress a boundless, unending concept into a single syllable. But have you captured infinity? Or have you merely pointed to it with a fragile placeholder? Language allows you to gesture toward the vastness, but it cannot contain it. It's like trying to pour the ocean into a thimble. The paradox deepens when you turn language back on itself. Think of the classic liar's paradox. This sentence is false. If the statement is true, it must be false. But if it's false, it must be true. Here, language doesn't just fail to describe the world, it collapses under the weight of its own rules. Words become self-defeating. They create contradictions not because reality is broken, but because the structure of language itself allows traps. Now extend this problem to knowledge. We believe that by naming something, we understand it. You say, tree, and suddenly a towering oak is reduced to a single, simple word. The complexity, the millions of leaves, the microscopic cells, the shifting dance of photosynthesis is erased. Language gives you a shortcut, but at a cost. It both reveals and hides. It communicates while simultaneously censoring reality. This raises a haunting question. Do we live in reality itself or in the shadow cast by language? When you fall in love, the experience is vast, chaotic, overwhelming. But when you say, I love you, you compress it into 3 small words. They carry weight, yes, but do they hold the whole or just a trace? Philosophers and poets have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. Wittgenstein famously declared, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." But silence feels unsatisfying. Humans ache to express what cannot be expressed, even if it means twisting language into metaphors, paradoxes, or contradictions. Mystics use riddles, poets use symbols, and philosophers push logic until it snaps, all to stretch words to their breaking point. But maybe the paradox isn't a failure. Maybe it's a feature. The fact that language can't capture everything reminds us that reality is bigger than speech. Words are tools, not totalities. They help us map the terrain, but they are not the terrain itself. Just as a photograph isn't the person, a sentence isn't the truth, it's only a reflection. Think again of the blind person and the color red. You cannot transmit the experience, but in failing, you reveal something profound, the boundary between knowledge and being. Some things can only be lived, not said. The paradox of language isn't just about communication, it's about existence itself. It forces us to confront the fact that some truths must be experienced in silence. And here's the final twist. Even knowing this, we still speak. We still write poems, tell stories, and invent new words to chase the ineffable. Language might never achieve omnipotence, but it achieves something almost as miraculous. It lets us reach toward the impossible, even if we never touch it. The paradox of language is not that it fails, but that in its failure it still manages to connect us halfway across the unbridgeable gap of reality. The grandfather paradox. Picture this. You build a time machine. After years of calculations, sleepless nights, and impossible engineering, it finally works. You step inside, set the dial, and suddenly you're in the past, standing in front of your grandfather before he ever had children. Now imagine this. You kill him. The logic is brutal. If your grandfather dies before having kids, then your parent is never born. If your parent is never born, you're never born. And if you're never born, how did you travel back in time to kill him in the first place? That's the grandfather paradox, a loop with no escape, a contradiction that challenges not just time travel, but the very structure of cause and effect. At first glance, the paradox seems simple, a puzzle of logic. But it cuts deep. It asks whether reality itself can break. If time travel is possible, do we risk unraveling causality? Or is time immune to paradox? There are a few ways philosophers and physicists try to escape the trap. 1. The self-consistency principle. According to this view, time won't let you create contradictions. You might travel to the past, but something will always stop you from killing your grandfather. The gun jams. You slip. He survives by chance. In this version, the past is fixed. No matter what you do, history holds. You can visit, but you can't change. 2. The branching universes theory. Another possibility is the multiverse. You go back, you kill your grandfather, but instead of erasing your own existence, you simply shift timelines. In one universe, you still exist. In another, you never will. The paradox disappears because cause and effect no longer flow in a single straight line. Instead, reality forks into infinite paths. 3. The illusion of time. Some argue the paradox doesn't exist because time itself doesn't flow. Past, present, and future all coexist in a block universe. You can't truly change the past because it's not back there. It's just another coordinate in space-time already set. From this angle, the paradox is only a problem because we misunderstand what time is. But even outside physics, the grandfather paradox is a mirror for our lives. Think of regret. How often do we wish we could go back and change something? A choice, a mistake, a word left unsaid. We fantasize about fixing the past, but if we truly could, wouldn't it unravel everything that followed? That regret shaped you. It led you here. Remove it, and you erase the self who now wishes it gone. This paradox also plays out in identity. Who are you without your history? If you could rewrite one key event, would you still be you, or would you be someone else entirely? Perhaps the paradox suggests that the past, however painful, is inseparable from who you are. There's also an emotional version of the paradox. Think of the child who hates their parents' strictness. They vow to raise their own children differently. But in reacting to that strictness, they're still shaped by it. In trying to undo the past, they recreate it in a new form. The grandfather paradox lived out in family dynamics. In science fiction, the paradox is a favorite because it highlights the fragility of reality. One decision in the past can ripple forward, threatening the present. But in philosophy, it's a reminder that we're all tied to causes we didn't choose. You didn't choose your family, your culture, your birthplace. And yet those unchosen factors built the very conditions of your freedom. Here's the unsettling twist. Maybe the paradox isn't about time at all. Maybe it's about limits. We long to undo, redo, reshape, but perhaps existence resists. The grandfather paradox might be the universe's way of telling us, you can't escape your own becoming. But there's another way to see it. Instead of despair, the paradox can inspire acceptance. You don't need to kill your grandfather. You don't need to rewrite history. You only need to understand that every choice, mistake, and accident is already woven into the fabric of who you are. The paradox dissolves not in science, but in peace, with yourself, your past, your path. So imagine again. You step into the time machine. You set the dial. But when the doors open, you don't go to the past. You walk back into the present, the only time you can change, the only time that matters. The archive of echoes. Paradox. Imagine walking into a cavernous hall. The walls stretch high, polished smooth, and every sound you make bounces back at you. You whisper, and the echo returns, not once but over and over, fading, but never gone. Now imagine that every word you've ever spoken still exists somewhere, rippling endlessly through time and space. If every sound persists, then nothing is ever truly gone. But if every echo overlaps, how can any one voice ever be said to exist on its own? This is the archive of echoes paradox. It begins with something ordinary, sound. You speak, the vibration moves through air. It decays, it's gone. But in a cosmic sense, is it ever really gone? Energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. The vibration disperses, but the trace persists, scattered, stretched, dissolved into background noise. Your words become part of the hum of the universe, forgotten but still there. The paradox sharpens when you think about memory. Every word spoken is recorded in the mind of the listener, reshaped in their recollection. But memory distorts. What you said becomes what they heard, and what they heard becomes what they recall. Your original words scatter into infinite interpretations, none perfectly faithful, all slightly bent. So, which one is true? Extend this further. Imagine a perfect machine that could record every vibration of air since the dawn of speech. Every laugh, every cry, every confession, every secret. The archive would contain the entire history of human sound. But here's the trap. If you could play it back, you wouldn't hear history. You'd hear an incomprehensible wall of overlapping voices. The act of preserving everything destroys meaning. The archive becomes noise. That's the paradox. Memory demands selection. Meaning requires forgetting, yet forgetting erases reality. So what is more real, the echo preserved forever or the silence that follows? Psychologically, the archive of echoes paradox mirrors how we live. Regret is an echo that refuses to fade. Praise is an echo that grows louder in memory. Trauma is an echo that repeats until it shapes identity. Each echo is distorted, exaggerated, or minimized, but none are ever fully erased. You carry them all, whether you notice or not. Socially, the paradox plays out in culture. Stories are told, retold, and altered. Myths grow from whispers. Histories are written from fragments of echoes. The further we get from the source, the less the original matters. The echo becomes the story. But if the echo is all that survives, does that mean it is the truth? Or just a shadow of truth, mistaken for the real thing? Now consider the digital age. Every word you post online is archived, cached, stored on a server. Even if you delete it, the echo persists in backups, screenshots, memories. The internet never forgets. It is the modern cavern of echoes. Yet because everything persists, meaning dilutes. The more voices stored, the harder it becomes to distinguish signal from noise. Philosophically, the archive of echoes paradox asks, what does it mean for something to end? If traces remain forever, can we ever truly escape the past? Or are we haunted endlessly, not by ghosts, but by echoes of our own making? Here's the cruel beauty. Sometimes echoes comfort. A loved one's words replay in memory long after they're gone. The echo sustains them. But sometimes echoes trap. A single insult can replay forever, louder than the 1,000 kind words spoken alongside it. The paradox is that echoes are both survival and prison, reminders of love, reminders of pain, reminders that nothing is ever completely over. And here's the final twist. Maybe the paradox isn't about sound at all. Maybe it's about being. If nothing is ever erased, if every action, every word, every choice leaves an echo, then life itself is an archive. You are not a single voice. You are a chorus of everything you've ever done, reverberating endlessly. The paradox is that while we crave permanence, it's already here. And while we long to forget, forgetting may be impossible. So next time you speak, pause. Listen to the silence that follows. Ask yourself, is it silence? Or is it an archive of echoes, waiting, whispering, carrying pieces of you into forever? The paradox of silence. Imagine a crowded room. Voices rise and fall, chairs scrape, footsteps shuffle. Then suddenly, silence. The noise cuts off and everyone freezes. You feel it, don't you? The silence isn't empty. It's thick, charged, heavy with expectation. That's the beginning of the paradox of silence, how something defined as nothing can feel louder than sound itself. At first, silence seems simple, the absence of noise, but when you examine it closely, silence transforms into presence. A pause before a symphony crashes in, a courtroom waiting for a verdict, a phone ringing unanswered. Silence doesn't feel like nothing. It feels like something. And yet, by definition, it shouldn't exist at all. The paradox deepens in language. You can speak words, but you can also communicate through silence. Refusing to answer a question says as much as any reply. A pause in conversation can mean agreement, hesitation, or judgment. Silence carries messages, but the messages contradict. How can nothingness be so full of meaning? Culturally, silence splits. In monasteries, silence is sacred, a path to enlightenment. In interrogations, silence is defiance, an act of resistance. In relationships, silence can be comfort. Two people sitting together, no need for words. Or it can be destruction, the cold shoulder, the absence of connection. Silence is both peace and war, both intimacy and exile. The paradox is that silence is never neutral, though it appears to be. In physics, silence mirrors the void of space. Outer space seems silent, but it's filled with invisible radiation, particles and waves. The silence of space isn't empty. It's saturated with what we cannot hear. Just as in life, silence is rarely absence. It's a container for what we don't notice or can't express. The paradox sharpens when we think of memory. Consider a moment you remember not for what was said, but for what wasn't. The silence after someone walked away. The silence at a funeral when no words could reach. These silences stay with us more than the speeches. Absence defines presence. Silence defines sound. Without silence, noise would lose meaning. In art, silence is as powerful as expression. John Cage's piece, 4 minutes 33 seconds, instructs musicians not to play a single note. The audience sits, waiting, and realizes that the performance is the sound of the world itself. Shuffling feet, coughing, breathing. Silence reveals what is always there but unnoticed. It's not empty, it's overflowing. Psychologically, silence can heal, but it can also haunt. Meditation uses silence to still the mind, but isolation uses silence to break it. Solitary confinement, one of the harshest punishments, is silence weaponized. The same absence that brings peace can also bring torment. So here's the paradox distilled. Silence is defined as nothing, but experienced as everything. It is empty, yet charged. It is absence, yet overflowing. It communicates even when it refuses to speak. And perhaps the final twist is this. We only notice silence because of sound. It's not silence itself that carries weight, it's the contrast. Silence is the shadow of noise, the pause that gives rhythm, the gap that gives meaning. Without silence, we would never know what it means to listen. What the paradox of memory. Close your eyes and summon a memory. Maybe it's the smell of birthday candles, the feel of a childhood toy, or a voice you loved long ago. It seems vivid, sharp, real, as though you've reached back into time itself. But here's the truth. Memory isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction. Each recall isn't playback. It's rewriting. That's the heart of the paradox of memory. Our memories define us, yet they shift every time we touch them. If who we are depends on memory and memory changes, then what does it mean to be the same person across time? Neuroscience shows that recalling a memory destabilizes it. In that moment, the brain reopens the file, leaving it vulnerable to alteration before saving it again. Small details shift. Emotions bleed in. Later, you recall not the original event, but the last version you reconstructed. The more you remember, the less accurate the memory becomes. Ironically, the clearest memories, our strongest anchors of identity, may be the most distorted. The paradox only deepens when we consider false memories. Entirely fabricated recollections can feel as real as genuine ones. Experiments have convinced people they were lost in a mall as children, hugged by Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, or even committed crimes they never did. If a false memory can shape your behavior, emotions, even personality, does it matter whether it's true? Psychologically, memory shapes identity. You believe you're continuous because you remember being yourself yesterday, last year, decades ago. But what if those memories shift? What if your childhood self would no longer recognize the story you tell about them? Are you still the same person? Or are you just a narrative stitched together from unreliable fragments? The paradox of memory whispers that identity may not be fixed at all, just a story you revise daily. Now think of collective memory. Nations build identities on memories of wars, victories, and revolutions. But these are curated. Textbooks omit, monuments glorify, propaganda rewrites. History is not what happened. It's what is remembered, selected, and repeated. A nation, like a person, depends on memory to define itself. Yet that memory is never stable. The paradox scales from the individual to the collective, identity built on shifting sand. Emotionally, memory plays tricks. Nostalgia paints the past in gold, sweeter than it ever was. Trauma sharpens details into scars, making moments darker than reality. Love reframes arguments as passion. Grief turns ordinary moments into treasures. The paradox is that memory feels like the past, but it's always reshaped by the present. You don't remember what happened. You remember what your current self allows to surface. Technology adds another twist. Smartphones and social media create external archives, photos, texts, videos. In theory, this makes memory accurate, but even with evidence, interpretation bends. A smiling photo convinces you that day was happy, even if you fought hours before. Digital records don't preserve truth. They overwrite memory with curated versions. The paradox sharpens. The more you try to preserve reality, the more you create new distortions. Consider relationships. After betrayal, old memories sour. Moments once joyful now feel tainted. After reconciliation, painful memories soften into lessons. Did the past change? Number. But your memory of it did, and with it, the identity of the relationship. The paradox is that memory isn't the past. It's the present rewriting the past to make sense of itself. Philosophically, this forces an uncomfortable question. If identity is built on memory, and memory is unstable, is the self an illusion? You might insist you are the same person as your child self, but if your memories are altered, incomplete, or false, is that continuity real or a comforting story? Perhaps identity is not a fixed thread, but a tapestry woven anew with every act of remembering. Here's the twist. Maybe the fragility of memory isn't a flaw. It's the feature. Machines can store data perfectly. Humans distort, reinterpret, reshape. That's what gives meaning. Memory's inaccuracy creates narrative, turning raw events into stories. Without distortion, there would be no myth, no culture, no personal growth. The paradox of memory is that, in its failure to preserve truth, it creates identity. So who are you? The person who lived, or the person you remember being? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe you are not a single, unbroken self at all, but a story constantly rewritten by the act of remembering. And maybe that's the lesson. Memory doesn't just recall the past, it builds the present. Each time you remember, you're not looking backward. You're looking inward, remaking yourself again. The paradox of infinity. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the ocean, waves rolling endlessly toward the horizon. You can count 1 wave, 2 waves, 10 waves, but no matter how long you stand there, the waves will never stop. Infinity feels like that, an endless process. But the moment you try to grasp it, infinity slips into contradiction. That's the paradox of infinity, how something so conceptually simple, without end, creates some of the strangest and most unsettling puzzles in mathematics, philosophy, and human thought. Let's start with a simple question. Can infinity be bigger than infinity? It sounds absurd, but Georg Cantor, the mathematician who revolutionized the study of infinity, proved that some infinities are larger than others. The infinity of counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on, is endless. But the infinity of real numbers, like the infinite decimals between 0 and 1, is a larger infinity. There are infinitely many counting numbers, but there are infinitely more fractions and decimals. Infinity, which should represent the ultimate, is fractured into hierarchies. The paradox: how can something that has no limit still be less than something else? Consider Hilbert's hotel, a thought experiment. Imagine a hotel with infinitely many rooms, all occupied. A new guest arrives. The hotel manager simply moves the guest in room 1 to room 2, the guest in room 2 to room 3, and so on. Room 1 opens, and the new guest checks in. The hotel was full, but it still had room. Now imagine infinitely many guests arrive at once. The manager shifts everyone so that the person in room N moves to room 2N, leaving all odd-numbered rooms open. Suddenly, infinity accommodates infinity. The paradox is sharp. In the infinite, full doesn't mean full, and empty doesn't mean empty. Infinity also distorts our sense of probability. Imagine you flip a fair coin infinitely many times. What's the chance it lands on heads every time? 0. But what's the chance it lands on some infinite sequence of heads and tails? 100%. In infinity, the impossible and the inevitable coexist. Events with 0 probability can still happen. Infinity bends certainty until it breaks. Philosophically, infinity collides with time. If the universe had no beginning, then infinitely many moments passed before this one. But how could we arrive at now if an infinite chain had to be completed first? On the other hand, if time had a beginning, what came before? The paradox of infinity makes both options feel impossible. The future raises the same problem. If time stretches forward without end, then no matter how far you go, an infinite amount still remains. Infinity is both unreachable and unavoidable. Infinity also infects the everyday. Consider divisibility. Take a piece of paper and cut it in half. Cut the half in half. Cut that in half again. Theoretically, you can keep cutting forever. No matter how small, there's always something smaller. But in the physical world, atoms stop you. Reality resists infinity. The paradox: infinity exists in math, but perhaps not in matter. Does that mean infinity is real, or only a trick of the human mind? Emotionally, infinity can be terrifying or comforting. Some find peace in imagining infinite afterlives, infinite possibilities, infinite worlds where every mistake is redeemed. Others find dread, eternal repetition, eternal suffering, endlessness without escape. Infinity doesn't just stretch numbers, it stretches the imagination until it snaps. But maybe the deepest paradox is this: infinity can be both nothing and everything. If you divide infinity by infinity, the answer is undefined. Sometimes it's 0, sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's indeterminate. Infinity is the ultimate contradiction, collapsing categories we rely on: full and empty, large and small, beginning and end. The paradox of infinity shows us that the mind can conceive what it can never contain. It reminds us that human logic, built for the finite, falters at the infinite. And maybe that's the lesson. Infinity is not meant to be solved, but to humble us. It's the horizon we can never reach, the question we can never finish asking. The paradox of identity. Imagine waking up one morning and looking in the mirror. The face staring back is yours, yet also not yours. Time has carved its marks, wrinkles, scars, changes too small to notice day by day, but undeniable across years. You remember being a child, a teenager, an adult. But are you still the same person you were then? The paradox of identity asks, what makes you, you? Continuity of memory, the body, or something else entirely? Let's start with the ship of Theseus problem applied to the self. Every cell in your body is replaced over time. Your bones, skin, even parts of your brain regenerate. The you sitting here today is not made of the same matter as the you from a decade ago. If identity depends on physical continuity, then you have already died and been rebuilt many times. Yet we say you are still the same person. How? Memory feels like the answer. You remember your past, and these memories connect you to who you once were. But memory is unreliable. People forget, distort, and even fabricate past events. Imagine someone who loses all memory through amnesia. Are they still the same person? If yes, then identity must be deeper than memory. If no, then identity is fragile, something that can vanish with a blow to the head. Now picture an extreme thought experiment. Suppose technology allows for perfect cloning. An exact copy of you is created. Every memory, every thought, every cell replicated. The clone wakes up and insists it is you. Which one is the real you? If identity is information, both are you. But two people cannot both be the same. If identity is tied to the original body, then the clone is an imposter. Either way, the concept collapses. The paradox intensifies with time travel. Suppose you travel back and meet your younger self. Both versions share memories up to that point, but their futures diverge. Are they the same person? What if you travel forward and meet your older self, a stranger who thinks differently, remembers things you don't, and carries regrets you can't yet understand? At what point in that timeline do you stop being you? Identity also struggles with morality. If someone commits a crime at 18, but at 80 remembers nothing of it, are they still guilty? The same human body committed the act, but the mind that drove it no longer exists. Should punishment be tied to the body or the self that lived inside it at the time? Laws assume continuity of identity, but the paradox makes that assumption unstable. Religions and philosophies wrestle with this puzzle too. Some argue for a soul, an immutable essence that persists regardless of change. Others deny it, seeing identity as an illusion, a convenient label for a constantly shifting process. Buddhists, for example, describe the self as a bundle of sensations and perceptions, ever-changing, never fixed. Under that view, clinging to identity is itself the root of suffering. Even psychology reflects the paradox. Think of how people reinvent themselves, changing careers, names, beliefs. Some speak of becoming a new person. But is that just metaphor or literal truth? If who you are is defined by your choices, then every new choice reshapes identity. You are both continuous and discontinuous, the same and not the same, all at once. At its core, the paradox of identity asks, is there something permanent in us, or are we just stories we tell ourselves? And if it's stories, then which version of the story is real? Perhaps identity is less about persistence and more about perspective, like a river that's never the same water, yet always the same river. The lesson of the paradox is unsettling, but liberating. You may never be a fixed you. Instead, you are process, change, becoming. And maybe that's the truth. Identity isn't about staying the same. It's about carrying the thread of continuity through constant transformation. The paradox of nothingness. Try to picture nothing. Not empty space, not darkness, not silence. Those are still something. True nothingness. No matter, no time, no thought, no possibility. Immediately, your mind fails. Even when you strip everything away, you're left with the concept of nothing, which is already something. This is the paradox of nothingness, the impossibility of conceiving or describing what it means for nothing to exist. the logical trap. At first glance, nothing sounds simple. It means the absence of everything. But the moment you define it, you've turned it into an object of thought, and therefore it isn't nothing anymore. Saying there is nothing already assumes there is something that we're calling nothing. Logic collapses here. Nothingness is both necessary to explain and impossible to represent. Science against nothing. Physics doesn't escape this trap. A vacuum isn't nothing. It teems with quantum fluctuations, virtual particles blinking in and out of existence, energy humming even in apparent emptiness. Space itself has shape, expansion, and laws. Even if all matter disappeared, the structure of space-time would remain. In fact, some physicists argue that the universe itself could have sprung from nothing. But the nothing they describe is still a quantum field governed by rules. True nothingness, stripped of even laws, seems impossible. And if nothing is impossible, what does that say about existence? Perhaps the universe doesn't need an explanation for being here, because the alternative, pure nothing, could never have existed in the first place. But if existence is inevitable, then our deepest question, why is there something rather than nothing, may itself be meaningless. Death and nothingness. The paradox also shakes our view of mortality. When we think of death, we imagine darkness or silence, but darkness is still a form of perception, silence is still an experience. The mind can imagine only something. Non-existence is beyond comprehension. Death feels like nothingness, yet we can't picture it without smuggling in aspects of life. Even our fear of death might be misplaced, not because nothingness is comforting, but because it is literally inconceivable. Philosophy and religion. Philosophers from Parmenides to Heidegger argued about nothingness. Parmenides denied its possibility outright. To think of nothing is already to think of being. Heidegger, on the other hand, called nothingness essential to understanding existence. We notice being only against the backdrop of nothing. In Eastern traditions, Zen Buddhism treats emptiness not as nothing, but as the absence of fixed identity. Everything exists, but not independently. It exists in relation. Nothing becomes the space in which things appear, not a void. Religious debates lean on this paradox too. In theology, if God created the universe out of nothing, then what was nothing? If nothing truly existed, there would be no potential, no God, no creation. But if there was something, even God, then it was never nothing to begin with. Creation ex nihilo. Out of nothing, both explains and undermines itself. The human mind and nothing. Psychologically, the paradox of nothingness reflects how the mind works. Humans need reference points. We can compare big to small, light to dark, something to nothing. But without something, the concept of nothing has no meaning. We only know nothing in contrast to existence, which means nothing is parasitic on being. That's the paradox. Nothing depends on something to even be thought about. The final twist. Here's the strangest conclusion. Maybe nothingness is impossible, not just practically, but logically. The moment you attempt to imagine, describe, or prove it, you've already destroyed it. And if nothingness cannot exist, then existence is not surprising. It's necessary. The universe didn't win a cosmic lottery against nothingness. Nothingness never had a chance. The paradox of nothingness doesn't offer an answer. It reveals the limits of thought itself. It shows that some ideas can't be grasped, not because they're too complex, but because they erase the conditions for thinking at all. In the end, nothingness may be the purest paradox, everywhere implied, nowhere real. The paradox of truth. Imagine someone tells you, "This statement is false." You pause. If it's true, then it must be false, but if it's false, then it must be true. The loop never ends. This is the most famous version of the paradox of truth, a puzzle that has haunted logic, mathematics, and philosophy for centuries. It seems like a word game, but beneath it lies a fracture in how we define truth itself. The liar's paradox is simple, but its consequences are not. Language assumes statements can be labeled true or false, one or the other. But here is a sentence that refuses to sit in either box. It exposes the fragility of a system we rely on for everything: law, science, communication. If truth cannot be consistently defined, what does it mean for knowledge built on truth? The problem grows when you expand it. Imagine two people. One says the other is lying. The second says the first is telling the truth. Each depends on the other for meaning, and yet both together collapse. Or consider a book that says, "Everything in this book is false." If the statement is true, the book contradicts itself. If it's false, then at least one sentence must be true, which makes the claim false again. The paradox feeds on self-reference, creating infinite regress. Mathematics ran into this wall head-on. In the early 20th century, logicians like Bertrand Russell and Kurt Gödel showed that paradoxes of truth aren't just clever puzzles. They expose limits in formal systems. Gödel proved that in any system powerful enough to contain arithmetic, there will be true statements that cannot be proven. In other words, truth outruns proof. The paradox of truth reveals that certainty is always incomplete. Science encounters it too. Think of artificial intelligence trained to evaluate statements. If you feed it the liar's paradox, it freezes, unable to resolve the contradiction. Machines depend on rules of logic, but truth here slips away. Even humans stumble. Some resolve it by calling it meaningless, others by inventing three-valued logic: true, false, undefined. But none erase the sting. The paradox shows that our deepest structures of reasoning cannot eliminate self-contradiction. The paradox also infiltrates daily life. Consider promises, gossip, or politics. A politician says, "You cannot trust anything I say. If you believe them, you must disbelieve them. If you disbelieve them, then perhaps they were telling the truth." Relationships can echo the same loop. I never tell the truth. Every time we play with honesty and deception, the paradox of truth lurks beneath. Philosophers wrestle with whether truth is absolute or constructed. If truth depends on correspondence to reality, then paradoxical statements should collapse. But if truth depends on coherence within a system, then paradoxes prove the system itself can crack. Even language isn't safe. Words point to themselves, and when they do, they break. The paradox carries spiritual weight too. In Zen practice, koans often resemble paradoxes of truth, questions with no logical answer, designed to break the mind free of ordinary categories. What is the sound of one hand clapping works like the liar's paradox. The point isn't to solve it, but to realize the limits of solving. Truth here becomes something lived, not stated, and here lies the lesson. The paradox of truth doesn't destroy the idea of truth, it reveals its boundaries. Truth works most of the time, but when it loops back on itself, it unravels. It shows us that certainty is a tool, not an absolute. The paradox whispers that our logic is powerful but not complete, that meaning is vast but not total. and that even in our most careful reasoning, there will always be sentences that refuse to sit still. The paradox of the observer. Imagine a particle suspended in space. You want to know whether it behaves like a wave or a particle. Physics says it can be both, but here's the catch. It depends on whether you look. The moment you observe, the wave collapses into a particle. When you don't observe, it exists in a strange state of probability, smeared across possibilities. This is the paradox of the observer, a puzzle at the heart of quantum mechanics that reaches far beyond physics. It isn't just about particles, it's about the unsettling idea that reality may depend on whether someone's watching. The double-slit experiment makes it famous. Fire electrons through two slits, and, unobserved, they create an interference pattern, as if each electron passed through both slits at once. Add a detector to watch which slit the electron goes through, and the interference disappears. Suddenly, the electron chooses one path, as though the act of watching forced it to decide. This isn't superstition, it's laboratory fact. The paradox is that reality seems to exist differently depending on attention. Philosophers seized on this with alarm. If observation determines reality, does the universe exist when no one looks? Was the moon there before anyone saw it? Most of us say yes without hesitation, but quantum mechanics muddies that certainty. Observation appears woven into being. And yet, saying reality depends on observation raises contradictions. How can the act of looking change what already exists? How can the observer not only discover, but decide? Some physicists resolve it by saying, observation isn't human eyes, it's interaction. A photon hitting a particle counts as observation. Measurement isn't about awareness, but about entanglement, the locking of one system into another. But this only moves the paradox. If every interaction is observation, then the universe is constantly observing itself. If everything observes everything, then nothing is unobserved. But the question of what reality is without observers still lingers. Psychologically, the paradox echoes in daily life. People act differently when they know they're being watched. A student works harder under supervision. A driver slows when a police car follows. Even animals shift when under the gaze of predators. Observation doesn't just record, it changes behavior. The paradox in physics may be strange, but in human life it feels familiar. To be seen is to be altered. The paradox of the observer also reshapes identity. Am I the same when alone as when observed? Does the presence of another make me a different self? If the act of looking can transform behavior, then perhaps our true selves never exist independently. Maybe we are always co-created by the gaze of others, collapsing into versions of ourselves in response to the world's constant measurements. Culturally, this paradox appears in religion too. Belief in an all-seeing God makes every act an observed act. Morality becomes entangled with the idea that even in solitude, one is seen. Whether in physics or faith, observation carries weight. It makes the difference between possibility and actuality. But the paradox deepens still. If observation creates reality, then what was the universe before observers emerged? Did galaxies collapse into being only when the first conscious beings looked? Or was reality always fixed, and our role is only to discover what already was? Both answers stumble. A universe without observation seems incomplete, but a universe dependent on observation seems absurd. The paradox of the observer doesn't resolve. It remains a fault line between science, philosophy, and human experience. It teaches us that certainty about the world outside us may not be as secure as we think, that looking is never passive, and that reality itself might bend around the act of being noticed. Perhaps the deepest truth it offers is this: the moment we try to pin the universe down, it changes under our gaze, leaving us always between knowing and shaping.